1979 Revolution is the brainchild of Ink Studios and Naveed Kansari, an Iranian-Canadian developer who's previously worked at Rockstar on several Grand Theft Auto games, and most recently as a producer on Resident Evil 7. This is a modern point-and-click adventure game along the lines of a Telltale game in that it's narrative-heavy and the gameplay mainly consists of dialogue options. It follows the events of the Iranian Revolution, making the game itself fairly revolutionary. It's rare that you see a game about a subject matter that's this inherently political, especially one in which America can be seen as the bad guys, and even more so when you don't actually play as an American. Originally titled just 1979 Revolution, Ink Stories sought support on crowdfunding site Kickstarter in November 2013, but the project failed to reach its $395,000 goal. There have been some similar games seeking to tell stories about the Middle East that diverge away from the typical fodder. Some of those include That Day We Left, another failed Kickstarter game about Syrian refugees, and the upcoming Insurgency Sandstorm, a first-person shooter in which you play a Kurdish woman who just escaped terrorist captivity in Syria, who then joins a rebel army to fight against them. I actually interviewed the developers of that game, New World Interactive, over at Cliqist.com if you want to read more about that one. But for the most part, games like this don't get much traction in either development or advertising. For a time in the early 2010s, games about the Middle East were strictly about Americans fighting terrorists, and actual countries and insurgency groups always went unnamed. It was normal to see the Middle East from the eyes of an American soldier, but that's always been the problem. We see things from our point of view, or at least a Western one, and not from the people who live there. Kansari was hoping to change that by not only introducing a game of his own, but hopefully encouraging other developers to follow suit. Black Friday is set during two phases of the Iranian Revolution, the lead-up to the revolt itself in 1978 and the aftermath in 1980. Yeah, the game is called 1979 and isn't actually set in 1979, but we'll come back to that later. You spend most of the game exploring environments, talking to characters, and making dialogue choices, although there are some more game-y features in the form of quick-time events like holding down a bandage on a gunshot victim, dodging bullets, or picking up pieces of evidence, that sort of thing. From here on out, I am going to spoil the game, so you've been warned. We begin in 1980 in a flash forward. The opening is meant to leave you feeling confused and disengaged from what's actually going on, and I have to admit, I have no idea what's going on here. Basically, you're developing some photos and all of a sudden you're arrested without explanation. You're taken to Evan Prison where you're beaten and interrogated by somebody who insists you know who they are, though this plot point never really comes up again. We then flash back to 1978, to the early days of the revolution, before it was really a revolution, more a series of barely organized protests. We learn that the main character's name is Reza Shirazi, a photography student who just returned home from his studies in Germany. This Iran is very different from the one he just left. He's hanging out with his friend Babak, who has ties to the revolution and is anxious to get Reza involved as well. He takes you to a protest and you start taking pictures, and eventually you get dragged into a massive protest movement that shows various factions working together. Communists, pacifists, religious zealots, the Mujahideen, all hoping to overthrow the Shah. One of the photos you end up taking is of a man who's covered himself in pictures of people killed by the Iranian government, either during protests or via torture in one of Iran's political prisons, like Evan. These human billboards of suffering were dubbed The Walking Dead. Now, this game doesn't make much direct mention to what happened before any of this, why there are protests, who the Shah is, or who any of these protesters are. The game is aiming to make you feel completely dazed and confused throughout. Reza has been out of the country for a year and he's still a young kid. He doesn't understand what's going on any more than you do. So what do you say we try and shine a light on some of the background before we continue talking about the game? First, we must cast our sights all the way back to the aftermath of World War I. Calm down, I'll try and be brief. Britain and Persia, as they were known in the West back then, originally signed the Anglo-Persian Agreement, which gave exclusive drilling rights for oil to Britain. The deal fell apart, however, after a coup in 1921 by Reza Shah, an officer of the Persian Cossack Brigade. Reza took power and held it until 1941. The United Kingdom and Soviet Union launched a joint invasion and occupation of Iran to protect their oil reserves. They installed Reza's son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as the new Shah, and continued occupying the nation until 1946. After both nations left, Pahlavi held onto power, becoming the first Shah of Iran, essentially the king. After a failed assassination attempt in 1949, he began taking on more power, forming the Senate of Iran and handpicking half the seats himself. The other half, led by politician Mohammad Mossadegh, saw this as an attack on Iran's democratic values, and united to form the National Front Party to oppose the Shah. By the way, I'm going to refer to him as Pahlavi or Shah Pahlavi or something along those lines throughout this episode, rather than his more formal title of Reza Shah, simply because the main character of the game is also named Reza, and I just want to avoid any confusion. By 1951, the National Front held most of the seats in the Parliament of Iran, which was still determined entirely by the popular vote. Mossadegh was elected prime minister that year and immediately began curtailing the Shah's newly found powers. Later that year, Mossadegh's popularity grew even further when the parliament voted unanimously to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which the Shah was powerless to prevent. Even though the Anglo-Persian Agreement was torn up in 1921, a new agreement was reached in 1933 that granted drilling rights to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the AIOC, which continued after World War II. In 1950, the Arabian American Oil Company, AAOC, also began drilling in the country. Iran was getting a bad deal from both companies, but since the government was installed by the UK, nothing was being done about it. So in 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to take control of their oil fields, which meant that the government could seize all foreign and domestic oil companies operating within their borders and begin running them under their own control. Iran took over the AIOC's refineries, keeping some for themselves and selling others to non-British companies, while Iran sold 30 million tons of oil per year to what remained of the AIOC, which is today known as BP. Britain immediately began an operation to remove Mossadegh and reaffirm Pahlavi's power over the nation. For a time, the United States tried to come to a diplomatic solution, but Britain agreed to relinquish their monopoly over the oil fields, allowing 5 more American, a Dutch, and a French oil company rights to drill. After this, the United States quickly changed their tone. The CIA began working with MI6 on what would become known as Operation Ajax. The UK began lobbying other nations to put an embargo on Iranian oil exports, sinking the nation's economy. By 1953, Mossadegh's popularity was at rock bottom, and as his supporters began leaving him, he relied more and more on his emergency powers, eventually dissolving parliament and rigging a referendum that would grant him even more power. He used that power to make both the Senate and the Shah completely powerless, making himself the dictator that he once claimed he was fighting against back in 1949. Now led primarily by the CIA, Ajax started to take shape. On August 19, 1953, American agents infiltrated the communist Tedu party and encouraged armed demonstrations throughout Iran. This riled up the rest of the country, who began counter-protesting the Tedu. Now the Iranian army had an excuse to mobilize against its own citizens, and led by CIA-backed General Zedlollah Zahedi, it did exactly that. They fought back the Tedu party and used the opportunity to storm government buildings. Mossadegh was arrested, and on April 22nd, Shah Pahlavi retook the throne. Many of Mossadegh's supporters were tried and executed, while Mossadegh himself was placed under house arrest, where he remained until his death in 1967. For the next 26 years, Pahlavi held power as Shah of Iran, a mostly loyal supporter of Western powers. That all changed in 1978. That's also where we return to 1979 Revolution, somewhat counterintuitively. We pick back up with Reza and Babak, and right away we see one of the themes of this game shine through. A couple of protesters confront you over your camera. These guys are very much against the idea of an Islamic Republic, saying the Ayatollah has no place in Iran. Babak counters by asking what's wrong with religion, saying most people in Iran are Muslims. After that, we meet Reza's cousin Ali, a member of the People's Mujahideen, a more violent leftist group protesting both the Shah and religious followers of the Ayatollah. Finally, after getting carried away in the revolution further, you meet this guy, whose name I've forgotten because he's only got like 1 or 2 lines. He's a member of the Tedu party who want a communist government and a closer relationship with the Soviet Union. 1979 Revolution does a great job of not only showing most of the factions involved in the revolution, including Reza's parents who are firmly in favor of the Shah, but also that there's a lot of moral gray area here. Every faction talks about wanting a free Iran, but they all clearly have their own goals. Many have no problem using violence to achieve those goals, and none of them actually get along with each other very much. It's also notable for showing how not much changed before and after the revolution. It also does a great job of showing how a random, unassuming person, especially a young person, can be drawn into a revolution and be left with no choice but to pick a side, when they have almost no information to go on. Reza has no interest in what's going on at the start of 1978. He thinks it's all just some students angry about something or other because he's been out of the country for a year. But as he continues to hang out with Babak and Ali, and later a woman named Bibi, he gets drawn into the movement without really realizing it until it's too late. First, Babak takes him to a protest, which, thanks in part to meeting Ali, turns violent. Then he is taken to the resistance movement's headquarters and is mistakenly attacked, and then told that Babak has been secretly stealing Reza's photos and putting them in the propaganda pamphlets they've been making. Then he's told to find the mole who tried to assassinate their leader, and in a flash forward to the 1980 section, you find out that the person you accuse was later murdered, before finally winding up in the center of the Black Friday protest itself. Finally, by 1980, he's a somewhat hardened, ardent opponent of the government before getting thrown in jail and tortured. It's fitting, considering what the developers of this game have gone through. Naveed Kansari was branded a spy by the Iranian government in 2012, specifically due to his work on this game. There's also a concept artist who worked on the game, living in Iran at the time, who had to flee the country for fear of his safety. When word got out about the game, Kansari said, "It got picked up by the conservative newspaper in Iran, and I got written up as a spy. They're basically saying that I'm making propaganda. So as a result, I can't go back to Iran now. It really sucks because I've got some family there, including elderly relations." Two other members of the Inc. team also worked under pseudonyms for the game, an art director calling themselves the Iceman, and a writer going by Navi Sandi. Then there's voice actor Farshad Farhat, who lived in Iran during the 2009 presidential election protests, which is going to have to wait for another episode, unfortunately. Another person who worked on the game goes simply by Mr. Phoenix, a former Iranian soldier turned animator. "There's no space for growth or to further my life experience," they said. "Don't get me wrong, there are many artists in Iran who are thriving, and I have much respect for them. For me, it was about experiencing the world beyond Iran. My hope for this game is that people will learn what happened and have greater understanding for all people. From learning about their experience in the game, they might have more compassion rather than be dismissive." What Kansari and the other developers are saying isn't an absurd claim. Amir Hekmati is a game developer who's worked on a series of games under the Kumar War label. These games are realistic military first-person shooters about events in the Middle East. He was captured by Iran, thrown in prison, and given the death penalty. Eventually, he was freed after 5 years in prison and is now suing Iran, claiming he was tortured while in prison. Hekmati, a former US Marine, says he was kept in solitary confinement for 17 months, and describes being forced to use drugs just so his torturers could make him go through withdrawal and getting electrocuted multiple times. With all this background detail, it's a shame that none of it really comes through in the game. For all the great work Ink Stories has done setting up the protests in 1978 itself, it doesn't really do anything to explain what caused the protests that turned into the revolution, nor does it detail what became of Iran afterward, or even why the main character was thrown in prison to begin with. There's no historical context for what's going on. I think some of that's intentional. Kansari wanted you to feel clueless as to what was happening and not to be biased in favor of one side or the other, but the game takes that too far, to the point that you don't really learn anything about the revolution. There are the occasional documents you collect through the game, speeches, photos, text that you get to fill in some of the detail. They're similar to documents you'd find in other history games like Battlefield 1 or Valiant Hearts, but those games use these documents and historical asides as a supplement. They're there if you want to learn more, but the basic gist of the historical events they emulate is explained throughout the plot. In 1979 Revolution, if you want to have even the slightest idea of what's going on, you have to read every single one of these documents, because the plot isn't going to fill you in. If I didn't do my research before I played, I wouldn't have any idea what was going on, and the game's sudden ending wouldn't have given me any insight either. I appreciate Ink Story didn't want to overload the player with a ton of facts. Most reviews I read for the game actually praise it for not being edutainment, But again, I think the game goes too far in that direction and doesn't give us enough facts. All that stuff I said earlier about World War I, the British and the Soviet invasion in World War II, and the oil deals, I didn't expect any of that to be in the game, of course not. But the stuff immediately before the protests started, absolutely I thought that would be there, but unfortunately, it's not. So let me try and fill in some of those gaps between the plot.
This has got to be Caesar Badad. No Iranian family cooks this much food unless it's Caesar Badad.
After regaining his popularity in 1953, the Shah wasn't very popular. So, in an attempt to win back his popularity, Pahlavi started a series of sweeping reforms in 1963 called the White Revolution, named such because of the lack of bloodshed in implementing such changes. Yeah, I know. These mostly built up Iran's infrastructure, including its road, rail, and air networks, a series of dams, land reform policies that saw the sale of government land to the people, and an increased emphasis on fighting and eradicating common diseases, and the support of widespread industrialization outside the oil industry. These changes went on for 16 years, and while they did improve Iran's economy and way of life at first, it served to only further splinter the nation. While this was happening, the Shah still ruled Iran with an iron fist, suppressing political opposition with his secret police and holding on to much of the oil revenue to himself. And by the mid-1970s, the Shah began to accelerate the program, spending more and more of Iran's cash to the point where the economy was at breaking point. It all came to a head in 1978, when these groups started calling for the Shah to be overthrown and replaced by the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. An Ayatollah is a high-ranking Shiite cleric who inspires his followers, and only men can be Ayatollah, through decades of religious study and devotion. There's no formal recognition ceremony. An Ayatollah is commonly decided upon by Shiite clergymen and their followers to be the most influential and well-respected among them. Ayatollah Khomeini began speaking out against the Shah and his government. There was a growing sentiment in Iran that maybe he should be put in power. The game points out in one of its precious documents that Iran at the time had the largest income equality gap in the world. At this point in history, Iran was drawing in billions of dollars annually through its oil industry as well as US aid, yet the common citizen was deeply impoverished. At the beginning of the White Revolution, Iran's economy grew at an exponential rate. Obviously, the industries that the government was putting the most effort into, such as construction and manufacturing, were booming, while other areas that were largely overlooked, like farming, weren't doing nearly as well. Job opportunities in rural areas plummeted while they grew in urban centers, but overall, even the non-oil sectors were growing at a decent rate prior to the mid-70s. According to Iranian Economy in the 20th Century, A Global Perspective, written by University of Illinois professor Hadi Sulahi Esafani and Cambridge professor M. Hashim Parasan, between 1963 and 1977, the overall GDP, gross domestic product, of Iran grew an average of 8% per year, and all non-oil sectors grew even higher at 8.6% per year. That all started going downhill in 1973 when oil prices rose fourfold. This was also the year that the Shah planned to double the government's expenditure on public works. The paper goes on to say, although a significant portion of the increased revenue was directed towards investment, the economy overheated and started experiencing high and rising inflation in the mid-1970s. The government's attempts to control inflation, sometimes by draconian measures such as prosecuting shopkeepers for price increases, and private investors' reaction to those measures and to increased economic instability, soon led to sharp declines in investment and GDP. According to some of the background facts provided by the game, Iran adopted what would soon become one of US President Ronald Reagan's defining policies: trickle-down economics for its oil industry. The belief that income generated from oil sales would make its way down Iran's various economic and social classes. But the lower-class citizens were severely underpaid and worked in dangerous conditions. This was made all the worse by the United States pumping estimates of $1.2 billion into Iran between the 1953 coup until 1979, money that nobody outside the government saw. This downward trend would continue even after the revolution up to the 2000s, made worse by economic sanctions and a costly 8-year war with neighboring Iraq. The next big talking point that's mentioned quite frequently in the game is the 1978 Cinema Rex fire. It's quite an important turning point during the Iranian Revolution, and one that's rightly brought up many times throughout the game, especially during the section where you're with the protesters hiding out in an old movie theater that was shut down by the government. As the game tells it, the Cinema Rex fire was a terrorist attack on a movie theater on August 19, 1978, in the town of Abudan. Babak blames the attack on the Shah, or at least people loyal to him. Reza says it couldn't have been the Shah, as the theater was full of Shah supporters. This reflects the fact that nobody knows who set the fire that killed somewhere between 370 and 440 people. What we do know is that 4 attackers blocked the doors to a showing of the Iranian film The Deers. They poured gasoline throughout the theater and set it ablaze, locking the doors behind them. Some were able to escape through the roof, but the majority of patrons died in the fire thanks to the slow response by the fire department and nearby fire hydrants that weren't working properly. After the revolution, the government arrested and executed former Iranian police captain Monir Tahari. The government claimed Tahari received guerrilla training in the United States, as well as murdering 3 people in Rudsar, receiving a Medal of Honor, and involvement in the torture of political prisoners in Mashhad and Shiraz. Their belief was that the Shah's political police force, the Savak, which Tahari worked for, were responsible for setting the fire, whereas those loyal to the Shah maintain it was done by Islamic extremists. Jamshid Ahmadzogar, who was prime minister at the time, resigned days later and was replaced by Jafar Sharif Amani. This did nothing to satiate the anger that erupted over the attack and the government's inability to figure out who the attackers were. The old movie theaters the protesters holed up in the game, on the other hand, is also a real theater in Tehran. It's called Radio City Cinema and was first built in 1958 as a luxurious, modern Western movie theater. It's an interesting dynamic to see the protesters, many of whom were anti-West and anti-American, holed up in a place designed specifically to be like an American movie theater. But it was bombed in 1973 and went unused throughout the revolution. Apparently it had its neon light stripped away at some point and was converted to a pharmacy according to cinematreasures.com, but is now completely closed, and the building is actually in quite a bad state of disrepair. Small protests were already starting to erupt against the government throughout 1978, but after the Cinema Rex fire, the protests reached fever pitch. All of this protesting and rioting came to a head on September 8, 1978. The Shah had declared martial law in the weeks leading up to that September Friday. A curfew was put into place the night before, but that didn't stop protesters from marching on Jallah Square in Tehran. As protesters marched down the street, they were met by a blockade set up by the Iranian army, their rifles pointed at the crowd. An officer ordered them to stop and return home, but the crowd didn't listen. After a moment, the officer gave the order to open fire. Mahmoud Del Kaheste, I'm sorry I couldn't find a pronunciation for that, was a kid back then and was there at the protest. I arrived at Jallah Square and joined a group of demonstrators who were closest to the army units. Soon a Russian armored vehicle began to fire at us with heavy machine guns. I ran, but I fell over a few women and men who could not move. I waited to be shot. Soon after the firing stopped, I looked back and saw people lying on top of each other still. I shouted at them, "Stand up, cowards, you knew today they were going to kill, and if you were so cowardly, then why did you come here?" But as I was saying this, I saw blood streaming from their bodies and covering the streets. If you'd like to hire me as a voice actor, contact me at gamesofhistory@outlook.com. Also, you're probably not very good at spotting talent. Much like the Cinema Rex fire, it's unknown exactly how many were killed at Jallah Square. The Shah's government claimed the death toll was 86 people. Meanwhile, French journalist Michel Foucault, who arrived in Tehran days later to cover the shooting, said the casualties numbered between 2,000 to 3,000. Iranian clergymen, eager for the Ayatollah to lead Iran, claimed that thousands were killed as well. It's also unclear how exactly the shooting started. Common sentiment believes that the military just decided to start shooting at the crowd, but others believe that maybe some elements in the crowd were looking for a fight that day. That's exactly how the game covers it. It's really hard to say who started it in the game, so they really paid close attention to detail and really decided to stick with their policy of there not being a good guy. But that's pretty much where the story of the revolution ends in 1979 Revolution Black Friday. It takes you from some random protests at the start, mentions a few details here and there like the Cinema Rex fire, the income equality, and the various factions coming together against the Shah, ending with Black Friday, but that's it. Black Friday was, in many ways, just the start of the revolution, not the end. The rest of the game, what little left there is because it's only about 2 hours long, takes place in 1980 at Iran's notorious Evin prison.
Her name is Bibi Golestan, but you already know that. Was she the one giving orders to Babak and your cousin Ali?
It was the first time I met her.
Have it your way.
Please.
Sippy care for me, tell him. Was she involved with Ali? Were they lovers?
I don't know.
Then she was with Babak.
With Babak?
There's no place for a whore like her in heaven. God only takes the virtuous.
You know nothing about her.
So it was you.
Throughout the game, we flash forward to Reza being held prisoner at Evin prison. He's tortured and interrogated regarding the whereabouts of Bibi Golestan, a revolutionary he first meets at the start of the game in 1978, but he's also with her at the start of the 1980 section as well. Evin prison was built in 1972 by Shah Pahlavi, and was built to hold political prisoners, anyone who spoke out against the Shah's government. While it was an awful place under the Shah, it didn't truly become hell on earth until the Islamic Republic was formed. Soon after, the prison began holding over 15,000 people rounded up by the Ayatollah, each deemed terrorists, foreign spies, or even just spreading lies about the new government, when in reality, the prison held everyone from political opponents to the Ayatollah, to intellectuals, to journalists. One person being held there now is Mohammad Hossein Rafi'i, a retired professor from the University of Tehran. Rafi'i actually spoke in favor of the Iran deal, in particular of President Hassan Rouhani, but was grabbed off the street one day and thrown in prison, and charged with distributing propaganda against the regime. He described the condition of the prison to his daughter, Anna Mariam Rafi'i, writing for The Guardian. Shortages of medicine in the prison clinic and a lack of access to treatment are other disregarded rights. My father says there are many prisoners fearing they have HIV or hepatitis who have not seen a doctor, much less received treatment. Due to the overcrowding, diseases quickly spread. Prisoners need to wait to see a general practitioner, and seeing a specialist or dentist can take several months. My father says that the quality and quantity of food is very low, with prisoners' meals insufficiently and mostly inedible. Fruit is a luxury item, he told me on the phone. It is available every 10 days in the ward's shop, however with low quality and high prices. While at Evin, Reza is tortured and interrogated by Asadollah Lahavardi, who likes to be called Haj Aka. Lahavardi really was the warden of Evin prison from 1981 to 1988. He was known as the Butcher of Evin prison, having been assigned the position of chief prosecutor of Tehran shortly after the Ayatollah took power, and later warden in 1981 after the previous warden was assassinated. Lahavardi was extreme, a militant activist in Iran for decades, taking part in assassination attempts and terrorist activities throughout the 60s and 70s. Under Lahavardi, Evin remained the largest political prison in Iran. He personally beat, tortured, and interrogated many of the inmates himself, killing thousands over the near decade he was in power. According to Ervind Abrahamian in his book Tortured Confessions, Lahavardi boasted that more than 95% of his guests eventually obliged him with his sought-after videotaped interview, which was just a confession of a crime, whether they were truly guilty or not. He then forced them to admit the error of their ways while praising the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Evin prison staff. Many of these torture methods were first taught to Iran by the United States, specifically the CIA and FBI after the 1953 coup. According to the game's documents, these torture methods included humiliation by being raped or urinated on, standing in one place, sometimes naked, for days, glaring searchlights, fingernail extraction, electric shocks, we see Lahavardi electrocute Reza's brother with a cattle prod, and bastinado, the whipping of the soles of the feet with thickly knotted electrical cables while tied to a metal surface. The post-revolutionary regime, meanwhile, introduced compulsory watching of and participation in executions and months-long confinement in 20 by 31 by 55-inch coffins. Near the end of the Iran-Iraq War in July 1988, Iraq launched Operation Mersad, a full-scale military offensive into Iran using members of the People's Mujahideen of Iran, a group of Iranian paramilitary guerrillas seeking to overthrow the Ayatollah. The attack failed, and thousands of these Iranian guerrillas were taken prisoner. It's said by former Iranian judge, lawyer, and Nobel Prize winner Shirin Ebadi that 4,000 to 5,000 of these prisoners were executed at Evan within a 3-month period of the war ending. So that's kind of our only big historical inaccuracy of this game. Asadollah Lahavardi couldn't have interrogated Reza in 1980 because he didn't start working as a warden until 1981. It's not that surprising that there aren't many errors in the game, given the extensive lengths Ink Story went through to make it, including interviewing 40 people who lived in Tehran during the revolution and 50 historical scholars. They even based all the graffiti you see in the games on photos they found taken in Tehran during the time. In fact, in one scene in the game, you come across old home movies from Reza's parents. It turns out those movies are real, and they're from Kansari's grandfather, recorded in Super 8 film from the 50s all the way up to 1979. Between the Cinema Rex fire and Black Friday came a few important developments, none of which are really shown in the game. Shortly after the fire, when the once small protests mushroomed into massive, violent ones led by hundreds of thousands of people, the Shah's government cut back on spending in order to stave off inflation, which resulted in massive layoffs. This obviously didn't help. The Shah was losing control of the situation, and he thought that total appeasement would settle things down. The Shah legalized all political parties and released political prisoners, allowed more freedom of expression, rolled back his political police's powers, and closed down casinos and nightclubs. Remember, that last one is considered a good thing because the revolution was led by religious unrest, and those people didn't like those sorts of places. Freedom of speech and the press became prevalent too, and the Shah began communication with the National Front Party about holding open elections. Finally, the Shah started clamping down on corrupt government officials, arresting and putting many politicians on trial. All of this, too, backfired. More political parties rose to challenge the Shah, newspapers were openly criticizing and attacking him every day, and the arrests of several government officials only served to highlight how corrupt his administration was. Now, what happened after Black Friday? Because that too is something that goes completely untouched by this game. A lot happened between September 8th, 1978 and February 11th, 1979. The day the military, which was still loyal to the Shah up to that point, declared a neutral stance and stood down from fighting the rebels, effectively the last day of the revolution. The day after Black Friday, oil workers across the country went on strike. By the next week, a nationwide strike in every industry was declared, and virtually the entire workforce began marching in the streets. Again, the Shah tried to appease the protesters by offering wage increases, but once again, this did nothing to stop the protests. In October, students began joining the protest en masse, taking control over the University of Tehran. Weeks later, on November 5th, a fight broke out between the students and soldiers at the university, which quickly turned into violent riots across the capital. Everything resembling Western influence was destroyed, including the British and American embassies. The next day, the Shah installed a military government, but made one final effort to settle things peacefully. He appeared in a televised speech vowing that he was going to fight the corruption in his government and praising his subjects for making sacrifices before then asking the religious leaders of the country to restore order. This actually worked and everything turned out a-okay for the Shah. Which is to say it didn't work in the slightest. As Desmond Harney, a British diplomat working in Iran at the time, said in his book The Priest and the King, the Iranian citizens could smell blood on the water. Ayatollah Khomeini decreed that there would be no reconciliation with the king, and called for Iranians to overthrow him. Months of protests later, including what has been described by University of North Carolina professor of sociology Charles Kurzman as possibly the largest protest event in history, the various factions vying for control all united under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini. It was clear to everyone, liberals, secular Iranians, communists, and moderate groups, that the far-right, religiously guided Khomeini would ultimately have control over the nation, and they all came together hoping for a piece of the pie once he finally did take over. That, of course, didn't happen. The Shah was completely crippled by indecision at this point, and his military government was paralyzed by the Shah's order not to intervene against protesters in any capacity. On January 16th, the Shah named National Front politician Shapar Bakhtiar prime minister in a desperate effort to appease the revolutionaries. The same day, however, he escaped Iran to begin what would become his exile in Egypt. Bakhtiar immediately dissolved the Savak, freed all remaining political prisoners, and called for immediate open elections. He also invited Khomeini Khomeini back to Iran, with the intention of creating a sort of Muslim version of the Vatican City in the holy city of Qom. On February 1st, Khomeini returned to Iran, cheered on by revolutionaries as he arrived, even being escorted off the plane by his French pilots. He immediately installed Mehdi Bazargan, an intellectual politician and strong supporter of democracy, as the new prime minister. A week-long civil war ensued, resulting in the overthrowing of Bakatar's government and the cementing of the Ayatollah Khomeini as the de facto supreme leader of Iran, a position he held until his death in 1989, at which point Ayatollah Ali Khamenei took over, and is still in power today. Shapor Bakatar fled the country in April for exile in France, where he lived until he was assassinated in 1991. Mehdi Bazargan resigned from office in protest in November 1979, 9 months after being given the position. He continued to hold elected office as a member of the Iranian parliament. What was he protesting aside from my awful pronunciations? Well, I think most Americans from a certain time know the answer to that.
Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's Friday morning there now, but throughout this night in Washington, officials will continue their search for...
Now that the Shah was out of power, the people of Iran turned their attention to one last vestige of American influence in their country, the American Embassy in Tehran. The United States allowed Shah Pahlavi to come to the United States for treatment for cancer, when many in Iran wanted him turned over and put on trial for war crimes. When this didn't happen, students of the Muslim followers of the Imam's line stormed the American embassy on November 4th, 1979, and took 52 diplomats hostage. Khomeini praised the students, calling the event a crushing blow to the world-devouring USA. 444 days and a failed U.S. Special Forces operation later, and the hostages were freed, seconds after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States as a final insult to previous President Jimmy Carter. The event forced even more sanctions on from the UN, and further cemented anti-American sentiment in the country. Every year on November 4th, the taking of the hostages is celebrated in the now abandoned U.S. Embassy by a ceremonial burning of the American flag. Meanwhile, Iran had bigger problems. On September 22, 1980, neighboring Iraq invaded in an effort to seize the nation's oil fields, while the new government was being installed and their economy was weak. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein was also afraid of the revolutionary fervor spreading into Iraq, and hoped uniting his country against a common outsider enemy would keep any revolution at bay. However, the war dragged on for nearly 8 years, eventually turning into the modern-day version of World War I. There was trench warfare, chemical weapon attacks, bayonet charges, and attacks targeting civilians. Much of the world, including the United States, backed Iraq, sending them money, weapons, and even helping to train their army. The United States Navy even skirmished with Iranian ships and oil platforms late in the war. These conflicts also led to the USS Vincennes, which was illegally operating in Iranian waters, shooting down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian aircraft, killing all 290 passengers on board. Despite this, the US still sold weapons to Iran too, which became known as the Iran-Contra affair because the money earned from selling weapons to the Iranians was being used to fund guerrilla movements in Nicaragua, and my eyes are bleeding. There's actually a lot of... Is interesting the right word for a bloody war like this? Well, there are a lot of facts I want to talk about in depth about this war, so if anyone wants to make a game about the Iran-Iraq war, that'd be great. Okay, yeah, that's not gonna happen, okay. Bear in mind that none of this is actually in 1979 Revolution Black Friday. It's not even hinted at, really. You spend most of your time with the game lost and confused as to what's going on, without ever really getting any of it explained to you. At the start of the game, Reza is no longer the confused kid he was in 1980. Instead, he seems to be confident, and at least somewhat a major part of something, as he's still taking pictures, and of course, he got arrested. But you never get that same level of confidence or knowledge yourself that Reza inherits between the end of 1978 and the start of 1980. If you were to ask me right now why exactly Reza was a prisoner, what Reza or Bibi, who you're apparently working with in 1980, believe in, or who this interrogator is that we're supposed to know is, or what the point of taking all those photos was for, I couldn't give you an answer. Not only is there no historical context for what's happening, there's not really any story story context either. Like I said, this interrogator insists that you know him beyond the historical context, and he even beats you to death if you refuse to say his name. Yet this plot thread never comes up ever again. Was this supposed to be like a wink and a nudge at people who do know his name from history? I don't know. And that's another aspect to consider, how 1979 Revolution works as a video game. And I have to say, it's not great. You know how in the Telltale games they make sure that your dialogue choices can't directly get you killed? How they make sure that they at least have some weight by the end of the story, but won't actually result in anyone beating you to death? Yeah, that's not the case here. One of the very first dialogue choices I had was the interrogator was beating me because I wouldn't say his name, so I tried to be the tough guy and I refused to say it even after he told me to and kept kicking me. You know what happened? He killed me, and I had to start from a previous checkpoint 5 minutes before that. I appreciate this is probably supposed to symbolize how brutal these interrogators were, but it doesn't really work here because A, he was already kicking the shit out of me to begin with, B, he's continuing to torture me throughout the game anyway, and C, there are other better ways to communicate this to the player than by forcing them back to a previous checkpoint and redoing everything again up to that point. What if instead he, I don't know, broke your leg and forced you to stand up for the rest of the interrogation, and maybe you had to do like some QTEs to keep your balance on your good leg, or he'd hit you again, and the more he hit you, the harder the QTEs got, and you get more and more distracted by doing these QTEs that you stop paying attention to him, so he hits you even more. Heck, if you really wanted to be ballsy, why not have him kill you and then it be a permanent game over, and you have to start the entire game over again? At least that way, the point you were trying to make about the prison being a horrible place wouldn't be undermined by the fact that you can just magically spring back to life. Pretty sure most dead people can't do that. Speaking of these QuickTime events, they are almost all terrible. Some of them have you just pressing a button to jump out of the way of something, and that's fine. But others, like this scene where I'm supposed to hold a bandage down on Ali after he got shot, it just says to keep pressing the mouse button. I was pressing it and tapping it as fast as I could for a good 2 or 3 minutes, but nothing was happening. Even after I stopped, it didn't seem to matter much, and I don't think I need to tell you how ugly this game looks. I don't have the greatest computer in the world, so some of these frame rate dips are down to me, I admit, but the terrible character models and animations are all on the game. I mean, look at this crowd. You see the same character models repeated multiple times, usually placed on top of each other. And what's going on with all the background characters' hands?
I don't have to justify my actions, you.
Normally I don't really care about this kind of stuff, but here, these graphical and animation hiccups are so bad and so frequent, it's hard not to be taken out of the game. Luckily, the game is carried by its dialogue though. While the overall plot isn't great and leaves a lot of blanks in the history, some of the individual scenes are beautifully crafted. You know, beautifully, metaphorically, I mean, physically it's kind of hideous. Whether it's trying to find who tried to kill the Resistance's leader, or the death of Ali and Babak, or the scene during Black Friday itself when you're ducking between cover and trying to get to an injured Ali, it can be equally tense and emotional as you try and save someone or wish them goodbye. The acting, at least for the main cast, is excellent too, featuring an entirely Middle Eastern cast, many of whom were actually born in Iran. The game was fully motion captured, can I use that as a verb? Which is surprising given the game failed to raise any money on Kickstarter, but maybe less so considering Kansari's background on working with Rockstar Games and as a film student. The Iranian Revolution is still celebrated to this day in Iran. They view it as their Independence Day. The Iranian government, now led by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and President Hassan Rouhani, is not necessarily hostile to anyone who makes games about Iran or the Iranian Revolution itself, but rather anyone they view as misrepresenting history or anyone they deem trying to influence Iranian people with what they deem as lies. A big reason why so many at Inkstory may possibly be persecuted by Iran is because of their connection to the United States, and the relationship between the US and Iran hasn't improved. Under President Barack Obama, relations, at least from an outside perspective, seemed as if they were improving thanks to the Iran nuclear deal. But in reality, things weren't much better behind the scenes. Iran accused the US of kidnapping one of their top nuclear scientists, the US Supreme Court ruled that Iran must pay $2 billion to victims of the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, and Iran detained 3 American hikers just a few years ago. Today, under Donald Trump, relations with Iran have only gotten worse. Trump has said multiple times that he plans on scrapping the Iran nuclear deal, calling it the worst deal ever, something that would be welcomed by the Republican Party. Trump is also expected to label the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, a branch of the Iranian military, as a terrorist organization. Iran has, in turn, threatened to bomb US military bases in the Middle East. Given how poor the relationship between these two countries has been, and how they seem to just be getting worse, it doesn't look like there's going to be any kind of peaceful conclusion to this story anytime soon. And what of the story of 1979 Revolution Black Friday? Well, I've got some pretty mixed feelings about my experience with the game. It's tough to play it as an American, mostly due to being confronted by the fact that this, and the Iran-Iraq War, was kind of entirely our fault, with the constant meddling and lust for oil. But also, what choices do I make? Do I side with the old American-backed government like a stooge, or do I support the revolution knowing it turned into a cruel dictatorship? The game doesn't do the good guys versus bad guys thing. It's more than happy to say, you know what, both sides were pretty terrible, but also show at the same time that there are good people on either side. That's not something you see in video games very often. On the other hand, as a presentation of a historical event, the game just doesn't work. I appreciate that some reviews I looked at said that they spent hours researching the topic themselves after they played, but some of that should have been in the game itself, so I don't think I can call it a success on that front. It's like in the first Destiny, where you had to go to Bungie's website to read about the lore in the game because for some reason they didn't think to actually put it in the game itself. I also feel like the Iranian Revolution is little more than a backdrop to the story the developers wanted to tell. You could easily choose any revolution in human history and it worked just as well. The government is bad, but the people who want to replace it are just as bad. You're stuck in the middle not knowing what to do. Well, it turns out that there might be at least a grain of truth to that. Speaking to Killscreen, Kansari says that Iran wasn't originally in the picture. And the fact is that when the game was just an ideal or a concept, it didn't even come attached with Iran. We just thought a revolution would be an incredible environment to create a game around. Then there are the common video game-y problems, like the terrible graphics and animations, the lame gameplay elements, and what can only be described as one of the worst endings I think I've ever seen in a piece of fiction. Stripped of all the outside factors and taken on its own merits, 1979 Revolution is the worst kind of game you can play. A decent game that feels like it should be so much better. On the other hand, I think we're on our third hand now, you can really tell this was a passion project for everyone involved, and they went through hell to make it. Between threats from the Iranian government, the failed Kickstarter, and spending 4 years in development, they should be commended for not only sticking through it, but for making a game about such a polarizing and important topic. I just wish I understood any of what was actually happening.
He knew what that camera meant to me, and he still let them take it.
It's just a camera, Pesara.
It was more than a camera to me.
Cameras are replaceable. Good photographers are not. Shirin-John, can you bring me a lantern, please?
Baba, can you help me find the lanterns?
Reza, I went through this in the 50s. I was on the streets in the middle of it all. There's no shame in being invested in your people's future. You must be proud.
I know, but Hussein keeps saying...
Hussein has found his path, and so will you. I just want you to be safe and be careful, and know that I trust you.